Welcome, everyone, to the Dauntless LeadHERship Podcast. Don't forget to like, follow, and pass along the links to your friends. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Alissa Hsu Lynch to our podcast. She is a longtime friend and incredibly impressive colleague. Alissa today is a board director, speaker, and host of one of my favorite podcasts, The LeadHERship Dance. She's a former professional dancer turned global business leader with over 25 years of experience. I choked a little bit when I saw 25 because that means I have more than 30 at industry giants including Google and Johnson and Johnson. At Google Cloud, she led strategic partnerships with Fortune 500 companies, driving digital transformation in healthcare way ahead of most people, by the way. As an executive at J&J, she managed multi-billion-dollar businesses across the consumer and medtech sectors. Alissa serves on the boards of The Honest Company and American Ballet Theater. A Henry Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute, she earned her MBA from Columbia Business School, where she's an executive in residence. And before her business career, Alissa performed around the world, living her dream as a professional modern dancer. Welcome, Alissa.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa. It's great to see you again.
So it's a funny thing interviewing a podcast host. I'm a little more nervous than I normally am. And I'm excited to have you here. But if I do anything wrong, you should just correct me. Um,
Well, now I feel like I'm in the hot spot because usually I get to ask the questions, so I should be the one who's nervous.
Okay. Well, that being said, I think we'll talk a little bit about that. You are so accomplished, and I too have launched and sold several businesses, and yet we still get nervous when we have important things to do and messages that we want to get out. And that's okay. And as this podcast goes out to lots of students and emerging young women leaders, I want to remind them that it's okay to get nervous. It means you have to plan, and it's okay to look back at something and say, learn something from that exercise, and maybe I could do it a little better next time. And this podcast, Alissa, is really about helping emerging leaders up their game. And you certainly have upped your game. I've watched you do it over, as I said, decades. And remember talking to you when you first told me, I think I'd be a valuable addition as a board member, and I'm going to figure out how to get there. And I have not done that yet. Something I aspire to do, so we'll talk about that as well. But I want to start the podcast today asking you what I ask every guest, which is, what does dauntless mean to you?
Yes. So when I think about what dauntless means, I think of being brave and of taking risks. So I think dauntless is the feeling of there's so much possibility and nothing's going to stop you from going after it, even if you face challenges. You feel like you can accomplish it.
Nothing's going to stop you. And I think that would be one of the ways that I would describe you and your leadership style, and also me and mine. And sometimes being a risk taker was not always lauded in our past careers. I know that at Johnson and Johnson, for instance, some people thought I was a little bit renegade. That's how I ended up in innovation and less in traditional businesses after many years. A risk taker to me is a good thing. Will you talk about risk taking a bit?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. So, Lisa, first I want to start with the story of how we met
Okay.
because you interviewed me for the full-time position at J&J. And I'll get into what my background was, but you mentioned that I was a professional modern dancer, which is something I did right after college. So I danced professionally for 6 years, and then I switched into business by going to Columbia Business School. And so I felt like going into business was a risk because I didn't have that background. I had a creative background. I was an English major in college. And I remember interviewing for J&J and J and meeting you, and you didn't know it at the time, but I was 5 months pregnant.
Mm,
And I remember you telling me in the interview that you had championed and pushed for the establishment of the J&J Daycare Center that was on campus in Skillman.
mm.
And I remember that really influenced my decision to go to J&J because I was pregnant and actually already had a little baby at home. And it just made me realize that J&J was a family-based company, but also you impressed me because at that time, as you mentioned, it was decades ago. That was not an easy thing to do. Not every company had on-site daycares, and you just talked about how you really felt like that was something that J&J should be doing as a baby company for the moms, for the working moms. And so you were a trailblazer then. You took risks to do that. So I just wanted to start with that story. But I
That was
think,
a very smart risk on my part, both bringing you on board without a lot of business experience and pushing to have that daycare center built. And believe it or not, even though at the time J&J was the baby company, um, it it took a lot of pushing to get there. And by
mm,
the time that it was actually built, my children were too old to take advantage of it. But I had the benefit of being able to say to people like you, come, we will help take care of your children and you won't have to worry about it.
yeah, I mean, that daycare center benefited so many women. So we appreciate you, Lisa, for taking that risk. But you asked me about risk, and it's funny because, you do those personality tests, so Myers-Briggs, and there's all sorts of different ones. And I took one when I was a VP already. I did this leadership program at J&J, and I was all the way on the right, so very high in terms of risk taking, which I knew, but I didn't feel like I was unusual. But I guess I sort of was. And I've just always been a risk taker. I feel like I like to push myself to grow, to learn. I'm curious. And to me, it doesn't always feel like a risk. It just feels like I want to learn more. I'm excited about new possibilities, or I'm bored with what I'm currently doing and I want to change. And I think because I started doing that early in my career, so, I mentioned transitioning from dance into business, but then also I moved my whole family to Shanghai, China,
Right.
when I was a director. So I'd been at J&J, I don't know, maybe 7 years at that time, and I raised my hand to do an international assignment, and that was a big risk. And I can tell you a story that was maybe a little bit of a failure, but I still would have done it all over again. So I think taking risks early in my career, I learned that I would be okay. And I learned that it would be a great stretch growth opportunity for me and my family in some cases. So I continue to take those risks.
I think it's interesting that you talk about risks for those of us who are far to the right, which I am also, as kind of satisfying our intellectual curiosity. We don't necessarily think about it as, oh my gosh, I'm going to take this leap, but more, I need to do the next thing, and I'm curious about what I will learn from it. And that's not necessarily how it's always viewed from the outside, especially for women. And as I think about emerging female leaders, I always think about if you're not naturally all the way to the right side, you should push yourself to get there. But you should also remember that the way that we serve up risk has to, in business, be in the voice of the consumer or the customer and not about satisfying our own curiosity. Although, in retrospect, certainly that was the case. I mean, I took this job at J&J to head up global internet and digital. We didn't even call it digital transformation then. J&J didn't even have any websites, nothing. And everybody said, well, why would you do that? We have no idea what the little at sign means. And I said, because we have no idea what the little at sign means. That's why I want the job. But it is kind of a
Hmm.
different muscle that you really have to push yourself if it's not natural to exercise. Um,
Yeah, and I think Lisa, you said it. You have to keep the consumer or the customer or the patient
right.
top of mind, and think about. I think the curiosity for me is also just wanting to make a bigger impact.
Mhm.
Um, when I make moves, I feel like, oh, I have something to add there. So it's not necessarily about just scratching my itch,
Yes.
but it's about I feel like I can do something more and help that business or help the people that we're trying to serve. And I think another thing is you have to do your homework. You mentioned it already. You have to plan, you have to prepare. It's not easy sometimes taking this risk, like moving my family across the world to China. There were definitely challenges. I'm not sure I was completely prepared for that because I didn't know what to expect, but yeah, I think preparation also helps.
I remember when you decided to move, and I also remember when you came back, and my perception was that the company didn't necessarily do the best they could at reintegrating people and providing them the next level assignment after they had been experienced running the Chinese and all of the Asia Pacific market, right? You should have moved up, and I'm not sure that happened. I saw that happen with other people, men and women that came back from global assignments. But maybe if you could tell us a little bit about that move. How'd you decide to make it? How old were the boys at the time? And what'd you learn from it?
Yeah, so my boys were 9 and 10 when we moved to Shanghai, and I had been on the Aveeno brand for a couple of years, and I loved working on Aveeno. So we grew that into new categories, into new distribution, and it's very similar to the Honest Company, which I'm on the board of now, a similar stage of business. So I really enjoyed that a lot. But like I mentioned, I wanted to take on a new challenge, and I felt like just moving to another brand within the US consumer business would be maybe not as fun as working on a Beano. So I, at that time, raised my hand and said, I'd be interested in an international assignment. And not that many people from the US wanted to live abroad for family reasons or other reasons, maybe not wanting to take the risk.
Mhm.
But I was willing to do it. And I didn't know where I wanted to go. I sort of left it open. I'm not sure that's what I would recommend. That's not what I did with my second
Okay.
international assignment. I was more specific. But because my parents were born in China originally, so they're immigrants from China. And this opportunity came up to lead the beauty business in the China market, so local market marketing role. And I interviewed with them, and I remember Cindy Lau was the head of China at the time, and she said, um, "Are you used to working hard?" And I thought that was an odd question. But when I got to China, I realized, okay, this is why she asked me, because it was just crazy there. The business was um, new. So Neutrogena was the big brand and Clean and Clear was there as well. But as a company, J&J was relatively new to the market. So there was so much to learn. What worked in the US didn't necessarily work in China. China itself is a huge world on its own, and every city is different. We were not in every city. So I just had so much to learn. And on top of that, was on the other side of the world, completely different time zone. I spoke a little bit of Mandarin, but was not fluent, particularly in business terminology. So every day my head would hurt just trying to keep up with what was being said or I allowed the my team basically preferred to speak in Chinese. So I said, go ahead and speak in Chinese because I could somewhat understand. I would have a translator next to me if I needed help. But it just taught me so much. Like my leadership style changed because in the US, I could listen and think about what I wanted to say next. And in China, I just had to listen to be able to understand. I had to like 100% be listening to the person. And so I couldn't think of what I wanted to say next. And that just taught me a different leadership style of, I think I'm a much better listener now, actually, and respectful of other cultures. But most challenging thing was that my older son had a hard time. So he did not want to be there. He's one of those people that usually has a few close friends versus being very social. Like my younger one made a friend right away. And yeah, I'm convinced he was depressed. He was having nightmares every night. He hated us. Um, he just was unhappy. And that really impacted me because it gave me that mom guilt of, oh my gosh, I moved the whole family here. Was this the right thing to do? And fast forward, I did ask to return sooner than I was expected to. So I came back after, in less than 2 years. And as you mentioned, when I came back, there was no promotion. I had sort of expected that to happen. And people didn't know the experience that I had. And this is actually very common for people who do international assignments and live abroad is you have this transformative experience personally and professionally, but then when you go back to your home company, people don't understand that. And so they treat you as if you had never left. And that's sort of what happened to me. And it was also the time of the Tylenol recalls, and there were just all sorts of issues. So I did leave J&J a year and a half after coming back. I went over to Bausch Health, general manager of their consumer products portfolio. CeraVe was the jewel brand. So, it all worked out. J&J recruited me back after 2 years, but yeah, so I've had a lot of transitions, a lot of challenges, but I've learned from every single one of them.
So, want to talk a minute about sponsorship? We'd love to have you. Just send me a message at lisa@lisa-kent.com. And right here is where you could be reaching and talking to our many interested listeners, talented, inspired, committed professionals who are looking to up their leadership game. Just let me know. Would you still recommend if somebody has a chance to raise their hand and volunteer to go ex-US? Would you still recommend that?
100%, absolutely. And I did it a second time with my husband. So when we became empty nesters, we moved to Zurich, Switzerland. And at that time, I was with J&J's medical device businesses. And we lived in Europe this time, English-speaking country. So I was a little bit more specific of where I wanted to go to land somewhere in Europe. But yes, I always recommend if you have the opportunity, if you have the interest, if your family is willing, because that's also important,
Mhm.
um, do it. Do it because you're going to stretch yourself. It's a great adventure. And maybe J&J didn't appreciate that at the time when I came back, but outside of J&J, my global experience has really benefited me. So yes, I would do it again, and I highly recommend other people take that opportunity.
A couple of things I take away. The first is learning to be a quiet listener. That's something that I'm still working on today. I always want to respond quickly, jump in, and I think is one of my opportunities for improvement to really sit back and absorb before responding. And I think that's interesting that you learned it because you were managing people who were speaking in a different language. It forced you.
Hmm.
Um, I've been thinking about maybe doing something international too. I don't know if you know, but I was a French major and a Spanish minor in undergrad, and I never really got to use my languages after school. And so maybe this will be the way that I learn it because the language
That
is
would be
my first language.
that would be so exciting, Lisa,
Yeah.
and definitely call me if you do.
Okay, I will. The second thing is, I'm sure that that global expertise and the fact that you left J&J, went to Bausch, who wasn't even called Bausch Health at the time, they were Valiant, and then went to Google, made you an incredibly valuable director in terms of understanding all of the issues that you might face as a board member. Can you talk about being a board member? How'd you become one? What are some of your favorite challenges that you can discuss and how do you act as a board member?
Yes, so there's so much in that question, but
Yeah.
I started thinking about board service actually when I was at Valiant Pharmaceuticals, which is now Bausch Health, as you mentioned, because I had the opportunity to present to the board. At J&J, I never really had that opportunity at the level that I was at. But at Valiant, where it was a much smaller company, I presented to the board. And I had coffee with one of the other board directors, a very accomplished woman. And, we just had to get to know each other. And she said, "Oh, I'm a full-time board director." And I'm like, what is that? I didn't even understand what that was. And she said, "I serve on different boards and, I get income from those and I advise them and I'm doing that full time." And I sort of filed that away in my brain as, hey, maybe that's something I could do in a future chapter of mine. And so that sort of got me curious about serving on boards, and I started to hear more and more about it as I got more senior at J&J. And when I decided to leave J&J after 20 years, my husband and I were in Switzerland. I said, maybe now is the time to build this portfolio of boards. And we moved back to the United States in March 2020, March 14th, 2020, and everything shut down
Oh
right
my.
after we got back. And I had a soft landing with J&J, so I was still with J&J, working remotely on a couple of projects over the summer. But basically, I had time to really think about what I wanted to do next because I didn't have another job lined up. And so I did a lot of board workshops just to understand what does it mean to be a board director. And it's different than an operating role in that you're not running the business.
Mhm.
You're there to provide strategic guidance, to help with governance, to help them manage risks across the business, and to ensure, they're doing their duty for shareholders and investors. So you're not there to run the business. And so that's a distinction that if you want to be a board director, you need to understand it's much more at that higher level. And if you do get into the business and start getting very detailed, you may get some pushback. And that's really the CEO's role, is to say, hey, we really welcome your input, but the team is on it, send us your thoughts and we'll take care of it. And then it, they will follow up in the next meeting. But um, so you need to be ready for that. So if you still love getting your hands dirty and running the business, then that's maybe not what you're going to get on a public board. Certainly early stage boards. I had to learn all of this. Early stage boards, private equity backed boards, they do welcome a little bit more involvement from their board directors than bigger publicly traded companies. So stories. So I just said all of that, which is that you're not supposed to like get into the business, but I was on a board where, I was doing that sort of separation. And we had an earnings call, we had an earnings report where the board was surprised by the numbers.
Hmm.
And they were announced to the street. We had missed the guidance and the stock dropped over 60%, over
Yikes.
60% in one day. Um, and that then required us to get our hands into the business. So, and they often say with being a board director, the work is it's, I wouldn't say it's easy at all, but there's a lot of responsibility. I serve on the audit committee, but um, it can be good, and then you're pulled in, and it can be every day. That wasn't the case with this company, but we did have to get more detailed. We scheduled extra meetings. We met with the next level or two down, just to all help them understand what is the flywheel for the business. Do we really understand it? Do we have the data we need? Is there more we can be doing to help? So at times, that can be super interesting and not just at that high strategic governance level.
And how about on a public board? And one of the things that I really enjoyed, I had the pleasure of interviewing Carla Vinlo when I was doing my Leveraging Leadership book at your suggestion. And she was so incredible. And then when I started researching you, because I wanted to ask you after hearing your podcast to be on mine, I saw that you plural, the board had recruited her to be CEO of the Honest Company, which, yay, very smart move. But how did you woo her to get there? And how have you kept that relationship going over the years?
Yes, so I did not have the pleasure of recruiting her because I'm a
Uh,
newer board member. So she actually recruited me to the
oh,
board. Yes, so it was the prior board directors. She had some turnover after she joined. Prior board directors, including the current board chair, James White, who's amazing, that did that CEO search. But Carla recruited me, and we have stayed in touch because we actually went to college together. We met at Princeton in a student dance company. So that was sort of my community at Princeton was the dance community. And we have stayed in touch then. We've had parallel careers in that she ended up going to business school, working at General Mills for many years in food. And then I went to Google, and then she went to Amazon. So we've had that parallel in terms of our career trajectory, but then she was then named as CEO of the Honest Company. So yes, so we were just texting, and she had been keeping me up to date on how it was going as a new CEO and walking into a situation where the business was struggling a bit, so she had to put a new plan in place. She recruited some new leaders. And so she texted me, I think, I have my leadership team all in place now, and now I'm going to refresh the board. So some of the investors are rolling off, and I'm going to be recruiting 3 board directors. And I literally texted her, hello, I'm looking for a board role, right? I had already joined my first public board at that time, but I was looking for another one. And so she's like, and I said, and reminder, I worked on baby and
right.
skincare at J&J. And she's like, yes, 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 that's right. That's right. I forgot. And so she introduced me to Spencer Stewart, who was running the search for them. And yeah, so I went through the formal process and was selected as a board director. But that speaks to the fact that networking is so important in getting board roles. They're not advertised. I think I just looked up a stat that 70 to 75% of board roles are filled through networking and word of mouth. So, you know, it's very hard. You have to get yourself in that consideration set. And yeah, often we're not in that set.
That's a really important comment. If 70 plus percent of board roles are filled without there being a listing or a posting, I'm going to guess that the number's something similar in terms of jobs. And one of the things that I like to say on this podcast and to women that I mentor is don't forget to network. Women tend to have a huge breadth of responsibilities and they neglect the networking piece in a way that men don't always neglect and miss out then on opportunities like this. But one
Mhm.
of the things I found in common listening to your podcast, Leadership Dance, and actually to my back episodes, is when you talk with successful women, you often find that they've kept in touch with their own personal board of directors over many, many years and that they did prioritize networking, even if it was friendship networking. And now I'm old, so my friends are all in, great high level responsible positions. And so now that network happens to have a professional aspect, whereas maybe it didn't 10 years out of college. So, how do we encourage women to make this a priority, assuming you agree with me? And it sounds like you do.
I do. And I learned it though. It's so interesting, Lisa, because when I decided to leave J&J, in total, I'd been at the company for 20 years and it was an amazing 20
Hmm.
years, most of it. Um, but I sort of raised my head and said, wow, my whole network's inside of J&J because that's how you do well within a large multinational corporation. Um, and I had very little, like I had a very limited external network. So I had to work at building my external network. And the easy place to start, I find, is your college, your community groups, or I did this fellowship program with the Aspen Institute called the Henry Crown Fellowship, where similar to what you just said, many of the people are very successful. and already serve on boards. And so I tapped into those networks, ex J&Jers. So if you've left a company, there's a huge network out there willing to help you. Um, so with boards in particular, I was told you just need to let people know that you're interested in serving on boards because that's how you get into the consideration set. And you never know where that connection may come from. Usually it's not going to be right away like, oh, I have a board opportunity. Glad you mentioned that. Usually it's by planting that seed. And I like to think of networking as planting seeds. Something will grow. So you have to plant as many seeds as you can and as much energy as you have to do, because sometimes I'll go in waves of like, okay, I need to get myself out there. And then other times I'm like, okay, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to take a break. But those seeds have sprouted for me many, many times.
I'm writing that down because I have not done that. Get my intention out there that I would like to serve on some boards and that I think I could add a lot of value. But what I am doing, and you talked about curiosity, is helping nurture entrepreneurial ventures that focus on aging people's needs, of which I am one. I figure if we don't help make the world better for people as they age, who's going to do it? And we're going to be the next generation that needs this. So I've been focusing on a number of those innovations, technological as well as physical. Um, but I hadn't really thought about saying, I might like to be on the board of one of these organizations as they move forward. So that's great advice. I've never been a
Yeah,
shy person, but it never occurred to me to just put it out there.
yes. So I know you earlier mentioned like women leaders,
Yeah.
and that is something that I highly recommend women get more comfortable doing is stating your intentions. And you can do it in a way that's authentic to you, but yeah, I mean, you're already networking regarding aging and looking in that space. And so just letting them know, and hey, if, when you're ready to have a board member or if you have any board openings, I can help you with X, Y, and Z. And I'd be very interested. So keep me in mind. And so it's just as easy as that. And then you're in their head. Yes. So my pivot into med tech really came about through curiosity again. So I was working in the sales strategy role, helping J&J think about their retail healthcare strategy. So at that time, the CVS's, Walmart's, all of them had these clinics in store, but they were looking to expand the services that they could offer through those clinics. And so J&J had me sort of dedicated thinking about, well, how could we as J&J help them? We're a leading healthcare company. We sell things in the back of the store, the front of the store that are relevant. And so I was working on a diabetes initiative,
Hmm.
creating diabetes set, offering up diabetes educators, helping to, just make it easier for the shopper to find what they needed. And then I was also working with J&J's surgical business around post-surgical recovery and all the things you might need in the store for that. And through that, I met people on the medical device side of the business. And I just really loved healthcare. I just felt like, wow, it's a different kind of impact that you're making when you're actually helping someone live better
Mhm.
with a chronic disease or helping them recover after surgery. I think I'd like to maybe move over to the healthcare side of the business at J&J. And so through networking, through letting my manager know, who was Caitlin Pappas at the
Yeah.
time, um, yeah, it took probably 6 to 9 months for an opportunity to come up. But then I was able to move over to the diabetes care business as the worldwide VP of global marketing. But after 9 months in that role, J&J decided to sell that business.
Yeah.
So that upended my plans. And that's when I raised my hand for the second time to move abroad. And so then I was able to move over to the orthopedics business in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And my husband and I had become empty nesters and had always said when we moved back from China, hey, it would be fun to live abroad again, maybe when the boys go to college. And so that's exactly what we did. And did that for a couple of years. And unfortunately, both those assignments were major turnarounds with restructurings required. And it just made me realize that was not my sweet spot. So I could certainly do it, but I got no joy from laying people off. And I really love innovation and kind of creating opportunities and space. And that was not what those assignments were. So that was part of why I decided to leave J&J is because I felt like, I wasn't growing as much, I wasn't thriving as much. And so that's when I left J&J, moved back to the US. And while I was thinking about serving on boards, I also thought about what would the ideal role be if I wanted to take another full-time operating role. And so I developed a criteria list, and technology was part of that, working in health technology. And I must have manifest that out into the world because Google called me
Huh.
and they said, hey, we have this role in Google Cloud leading the medtech strategy and solutions in our healthcare and life sciences practice. Would you be interested? And so I met with them and they said, I actually asked the Google recruiter, like, how did you find me? And she said, well, you applied for a role here a year ago, which I had completely forgotten about because they never got back to me. And so I was in their database. They're definitely data driven.
Hmm.
And so I got that job and I was like, this is everything on my criteria list that I said I wanted, and this will position me better for serving on boards. So I took that role and it was amazing. It was crazy and
What
was
was the
working
role,
around the
Alissa?
clock. Yeah, so they brought me in. It was a role that was not filled at the time, but they brought me in to identify what business problems we could help medical device companies solve
Okay.
using Google's data, analytics and AI. So all their tools and technologies. So I had to learn the technology, but I could bring my knowledge of, their customer of like, there are so many problems that I think you could help them solve if they only had these tools and technology. So I was putting the two together, developing the innovation roadmap. I launched two solutions, one for medical imaging AI and another working with Fitbit to
Huh.
help give healthcare providers access to wearables data. So it was so much fun because like anything was possible. There was just a different mindset at Google, like being first to market was expected. And I was just learning so much every day. And yeah, so that was great. But then I was laid off. I was impacted by the tech layoffs in 2023. And at that point, decided to pivot and really focus full time on building a portfolio of work. So including the board, speaking, and then launching this podcast, which I never would have done if I didn't have that space and time to think about it.
I mean, I have to say, I watched you perform and speak. And if you all in the audience haven't seen Alissa, she's on YouTube. I don't know, was it called the leadership dance at that point? But you definitely have a couple of speaking engagements out there if they want to find you. Um,
Yes, I'm looking for more and I'm building a new talk that really kind of integrates my dance background and business background. So that one will be likely called the leadership dance. So I'm test driving that right now. But yeah, it's been fun to be in this portfolio stage of life and just tapping back into my creativity. And I feel like I'm much more integrated as a person now that I have the space to do that.
How do you and your leadership stay true to the mission and purpose of the Honest Company, but still deliver on financial expectations? And for those of you listening, I read right off the website, and Alissa, you can tell me if this is still right. We've always believed small choices add up to a big difference. Call it the butterfly effect. By supporting Honest, you're showing support for organizations that share our values and amplify our impact, making happy, healthy lives possible for more people everywhere. Is that still right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the way we stay true to the mission is what you said earlier, which is you focus on the consumer. So Jessica Alba, as one of the co-founders of the company, started the company because she could not find clean, sustainably designed products for her own kids. And that is what Honest offers is baby and personal care products that don't use, there's a no list, which they call the Honest Standard, which excludes 3,500 chemicals and ingredients. So they will not use any of those. And they were one of the first companies to do that. And it's because that's what consumers are looking for. That's what moms are looking for. They don't want to put ingredients that they don't know what they are on their babies. And I remember, I don't know if I was still on Johnson's Baby, but I was still part of the consumer business when the company, the Honest Company, was founded. And I remember in typical kind of big company reaction, oh, such a small brand. We don't have to worry about them. And the company, Honest Company, is still around. We're delivering great financial results, but it's a combination of being mission driven, staying true to the mission, understanding the consumer, but then also, just good fundamental business building and marketing. So building distribution, managing costs, you still have to do all of those things. You can't just be mission driven. You have to do all of those things really well. And I think that's advice I also give on a personal basis of, I think a lot of people want to only work for mission-driven companies or only want to work on things that they're passionate about. And I think that's great, but recognize that you still need to learn the fundamentals. So you need to go in, work hard, understand what drives the business, how to run the business, and pursue your passion and the mission that you want to achieve.
I agree. If you can't get results, it doesn't really matter how mission driven you are. And I have two grandkids right now, and the parents of those grandkids would not buy a food product or a skincare product without checking the Yuka app. And
Hmm.
that was just starting when Jessica Alba started Honest, and people were dubious. I don't think today's consumers would have any question about the product. So getting out in front of trends is really important too.
Hmm.
Um, and I think something that your organization does very well. Um, Flipping gears a little bit just for the last couple of minutes of our talk, any business book or podcast that you would recommend to folks? What do you listen to? What do you like to read?
I like to read fantasy, so I'm not going to recommend that necessarily, but a business book is, I actually had a wonderful guest on my podcast, The Leadership Dance. Her name is Sabina Nawaz,
Mhm.
and she released a book earlier this year called You're the Boss, and it's for managers. It's how to be the best manager that you can be. So she's a former Microsoft executive and now an executive coach who advised Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer and many, many leaders at Microsoft. So she has wonderful stories in her book about how to be a terrible boss as well as a good boss, and a lot of really practical tips. So I think for anyone who's aspiring to become a manager or who leads a team of managers, there's a lot of great nuggets in there. And yeah, it's a quick read.
I'm writing it down and I'll super it over this part of the podcast as well. Um, what was the best advice you were given in your career? From whom? And why was it good?
So much good advice. I actually wanted to talk about Guy Verchi because
Oh,
I learned I learned so much from him.
me too.
Um, yes, yes, after every meeting, he would ask each one of us, "How did you think you did on a scale of 1 to 10?" And you're sort of trying to second guess, well, how did he think I did? How did I actually really do? And so then you throw out a number, and inevitably he had a different number in mind, and he'd tell you his number, and then he'd give you feedback on the meeting. And so it wasn't necessarily advice per se, but I feel like I learned so much from that because it taught me about just viewing everything as growth. So don't be too precious about, oh, I was perfect or the meeting went really well. It was like, what did you learn from that? And so that was early in my career, and I feel like I've continued to do that throughout my career. But it also reminded me of my dancing days because when you're a dancer, you're continually trying to improve. And so I loved sort of getting that feedback, even though I'd be very nervous when when I'd run into him after a meeting. But it was so valuable, it made me realize how much he actually cared about developing us into leaders.
He is one of my favorite people to work with. When I ran Johnson's Baby US, he was running Johnson's Baby Canada. And a couple things I remember about him is, first of all, he has the best sense of humor of anybody I know. Even in the most serious of situations, he could always make me laugh. And you know what? If you can't laugh when you're dealing with the business, it makes it so much more boring. So that was a great an asset of being in a meeting with Guy. But the second thing was he managed the same business that I did, but with a lot less money and a lot more challenges in Canada. And so he had a very entrepreneurial mindset for a large global corporation. I was managing, I don't know, $600 million, and he was managing, I don't know, $75 million of the same portfolio of business. And I learned so much from him about how to be more efficient, how to really set priorities. I wasn't great at that. But also how to laugh at yourself and laugh at what's going on. And you think about your favorite business experiences. And for me, they're always when I did something good for the world, but also got a great laugh getting there too.
Yes, yes. And I think the people that you worked with, for sure.
Yep. Um, so last question for you today is, as you think about emerging young leaders, would you have words of wisdom for them? I think most of the listeners here are people who are growing into their leadership style. Frankly, we're all still growing into our leadership style. So what words of wisdom might you want to share?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about this concept of choreographing your career and it being a mix of intention, but also improvisation. So my advice is, be a choreographer and don't worry about planning out every step. See where it takes you and be willing to make mistakes and learn along the way because um, hopefully you'll have a long successful career, but it's okay to follow the path less traveled.
That's really good advice. And when people ask me, well, how did you plan your career journey? I always have to say, well, I planned some of it, but I did not know that we were going to run out of money at Net Grocer, for instance, and have to sell the company. And it's really what you learn from it and what you do next that matters, not so much that the path isn't exactly as you imagined it.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Well, thank you for joining me on the podcast. And to close today, I will thank Alissa, and in the immortal words of Arlene Barnett, my mom, which is very true to the advice you just gave, you don't have to know what you want to be when you grow up, just what you want to do next. This is Dauntless Leadership and Lisa Kent. Thank you for joining us, and we hope we see you here again next time. Take care.